Hello, everyone. I'm Vern Friedlander from Bannister Lake, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. Real-time data has never been more important. At a time when audiences rely on up-to-the-second information, real-time data provides the very best opportunity for broadcasters, content producers, and public health officials to take advantage of every platform to disseminate vital news and information. One of the most important advantages of Bannister Lake's flagship data aggregation and management product, Mailin, is its ability to editorially control content from any source, customize it, and strategically distribute that content to any platform, broadcast, social media, websites, and streaming. When it comes to elections, real-time data is vital, of course, and we have a very special guest today, Decision Desk HQ's Drew McCoy, to talk about what we can all expect on election night on November 3rd. As always, just to let you know, we welcome your questions about today's webinar and our Mailin product. There will be an opportunity at the end of the presentation to answer any questions you may have. As you watch the presentation, please feel free to submit your questions using the Q&A tools on your screen. Simply type your question and submit. We will also be making a recording of this webinar available to you and posting it on the YouTube site, our YouTube site, which is youtube.com/BannisterLake1, as in the number 1. So on to today's topic. The presentation of data is only as good as the data coming into our systems. And when it comes to election data, we are in for something very, very different on US Election Day, November 3rd. Typical elections have results data flowing shortly after polls close, and enough ballots are tabulated within a couple of hours, sometimes within minutes, to provide a detailed analysis and to declare winners. But November 3rd is going to be very different, with systematic changes to voting procedures brought on by the pandemic. The volume of mail-in ballots is going to delay vote counts, and this will mean media organizations covering the election may not be dealing with an election night, but rather an election week, or perhaps even an election month. For today's webinar, we're going to do something different for Bannister Lake. Instead of focusing on our technical solutions, which, by the way, our Mailin product provides a fantastic, cost-effective election software solution for any kind of election, we are going to do a deep dive instead into what we can expect when results data begins to flow on November 3rd, and the impact that will have on timelines, making calls, and election coverage planning. We are pleased to have as our special host today, Drew McCoy, President of Election Results and Data Collection and Reporting Service, Decision Desk HQ. DDHQ is an important data partner of ours. Our Mailin solution reads DDHQ results data and provides election producers with the ability to use that data to analyze races, populate spectacular graphics, and manage graphic playout to any platform. Drew's insights are important for anyone covering the US elections. This promises to be an election like no other. We all depend on and require reliable, consistent results data to track voting patterns and tell the election night story. Very few people are as qualified as Drew to guide us through what to expect and if and when those results start coming in. Here's DDHQ's president, Drew McCoy.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for your time today and being here. Before we take a look at the challenges of voting in the era of COVID and what election night coverage might look like come November, let me just give you a little bit of background about Decision Desk HQ. We were founded in 2012. The 2016 presidential election was our first full election night coverage, and we were actually the first that year to call the presidency. We were able to make our call on Arizona and Pennsylvania, which are two states you're probably going to be hearing a lot about again this year, at 12:55 in the morning, and that put Donald Trump over the top in our electoral vote count. About an hour and a half or so later, the Associated Press and the networks, sort of between 2:30 and 2:45 in the morning, they were able to call Pennsylvania, and that pushed Trump over the 270 electoral vote mark in their counts. Now, let's jump into the topic everyone is talking about right now and the biggest challenge and change brought on by COVID-19, mail-in and absentee voting. I think defining terms is an important thing to do, and I'm not sure that it's being done a lot. So let me give you my understanding from listening to various reports from the president to high-ranking Democrats and state election officials about what we're talking about when we say mail-in versus absentee. I don't think the distinctions are as large as many people seem to be making them, or that is hardening in the public consciousness. Mail-in voting, or all mail-in elections, the key feature of those is that the election officials send a ballot, an actual ballot that the voter fills out and sends back to each registered voter. That's the main feature there. When it comes to absentee voting, what happens is the voter has to request a ballot from the election officials. That's the main difference. And it can be handled very differently in some states. Some states will automatically send out an application for a ballot to all registered voters. It's not an actual ballot, but just a form saying, yes, I would like you to send me a ballot at some point in the future, and then they have to send that back. In other states, it's incumbent upon the voter themselves to reach out to election officials and say, I'm planning on voting by absentee. I need you to send me a ballot when the appropriate time happens. So those are sort of the main distinctions. Now, if that's an accurate description, and I believe it is, of what people are talking about when they say mail-in or all mail-in elections versus absentee voting, then I think we have to understand the scale of them. Mail-in voting / all mail-in elections, where the election officials send a ballot to all registered voters, is happening in 9 states and the District of Columbia this year. Of those 9, 5 of them actually had the system prior to COVID. Those are Colorado, Hawaii, Oregon, Utah, and Washington. Since COVID has come along and people are more interested in mail-in voting, 4 additional states have said they are going to go to all mail-in voting and will be sending out ballots automatically. Those 4 states are California, Nevada, New Jersey, and Vermont. And again, the District of Columbia is also doing this for the first time this year. Now, in the rest of the states, there's something called absentee voting. And again, that just simply means the voters are getting an application from the election officials, sending it back, getting a ballot from those election officials, and then the voter themselves have to return it by whatever deadline their state has, and is either by mail or dropping it off at some sort of designated spot. Currently, 36 states allow either no excuse absentee voting, or COVID is an acceptable excuse to vote via absentee ballot. That means in 45 states, plus the District of Columbia, there will likely be heavy mail-in and absentee voter participation this year. In the remaining 5 states, there will still be some level of absentee voting, but it's limited to a specific set of acceptable reasons, and that's going to keep its use comparatively low. Those 5 states are Indiana, Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina, and Texas. Now, the issue that really is coming up is processing and handling of these ballots. And like everything else in elections, every state does it just a little bit differently, and you have to know the nuances of this to understand what you're looking at when you see results coming in on election night. The question really becomes then, why do these absentee votes or these mail-in votes take longer to process? Why are we seeing these delays that we didn't see in previous years? And again, it gets to the idea that voting in person, something we've all probably done several times, is relatively quick. You show up. There might have been a line to get there. In some places, we hear horror stories about having to wait 4 or 5 hours. In other places, it's 2 minutes to get to the desk where there's a very friendly election volunteer official, or somebody's getting paid a nominal amount, but they're doing it because they believe in the process. They'll check you in. You may have to sign the registrar book. In some states, you have to show identification. Once that's done, they will tell you where to go to vote. It'll either be a touchscreen or a scanned ballot that you have to fill in the bubbles, and then you hand that ballot to somebody else, and it gets processed. You get a I voted sticker, and you go about your day. Now, that's something that's going to happen, or has traditionally happened, in thousands of places across the state. You know, firehouses, schools, community centers, those sort of things. It happens over the course of several hours during the day, and in a lot of places it happens over the course of several days with early in-person voting. So the process gets spread out. There's not a lot going on for the voter, and it's fairly easy to tabulate them. Now, with mail-in voting, and again, using mail-in and absentee voting interchangeably, because at that point, once the voter has the ballot, the process is essentially the same. It gets sent back in. It goes to a centralized processing location, either in a county or a city, whatever the unit may be, and it has to be processed. And that processing is more involved than what you would do if you just showed up and said hello and got your sticker. The first thing is the envelopes have to be opened. Every absentee ballot, mail-in ballot has to have a security sleeve. And what that means is while election officials are handling the ballots and processing them, there has to be a way to keep the vote anonymous. They will know the name of the voter, but they should not know, obviously, how that voter actually cast their ballot. So you have to make sure that that part is handled. Then once you secure the anonymity of the vote, the election officials will have to go through the list, and again, this varies state by state, to make sure that the ballot conforms with the law. That could be a signature in a certain spot. Sometimes you have to have a witness. Sometimes you have to provide copies of your ID. They will also check it against other voting rolls to make sure that you're not voting in person. So there's a lot of work that goes into ensuring that these ballots are matched up with the voter. There's usually a security barcode in a lot of states, so that you know who the person is that voted, that they were eligible, and they follow the rules. That could take a minute, 2 minutes. Again, not a lot of time, but significantly more than what happened at your firehouse. But you also then have to multiply that over hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, in some places hundreds of thousands of ballots. It's simply an infrastructure. It's only so many hours in a day. People only work so long. People can only process so many per minute, per hour. There's just a math issue about processing these ballots with the infrastructure that exists. And that's where the delays come in. The second factor, and very important factor that gets into the delays, is there are laws around when those processes can take place. Each state, again, if you know anything about elections, everything's an edge case. Everything is unique to individual states or even the county or town level. So there will be laws about when election officials can begin to process those ballots. In some states, it's as soon as it comes in. Now, they may not tabulate them, which is the actual counting of them, but they can do that process of verifying that it is a legitimate vote, that the voter has followed all the rules, that they're an eligible voter. All that sort of work can begin when it comes in. Some states it'll be 2 weeks, some it'll be 2 days, and that gives them a head start. And those will be the states where you see really fast quantities of votes being reported shortly after poll closing, because they've done that work prior to it. Florida is a great example of that. North Carolina is a good example of that. Arizona is a great example of that. Now, other states will have other rules and regulations, and they can include not being able to process anything until the polls open. Some will say not until the polls close. Others will say not for a week. That actually was the rule in New York. It may change, but the rule in New York was you couldn't process absentee ballots for a week. And they actually wound up extending that for another week for some reason. And that's why you saw the delays there. So that rule that every state has is really important. It's really important to know that and understand that's going to give you a really good indication of what kind of numbers you'll be able to see out of a specific state on election night and in the days following. Another deadline to know about and to understand why it will add time to counting is when are voters allowed to return their ballots and still have it counted. If you're mailing it in, some states will say it has to be in by election night. Florida, for example, they will know what their total universe of ballots is that night. They may not count them all. They may not be able to process them all. But they know when the polls close, that's the list of ballots they have. Other states will say it's postmarked. As long as it's postmarked by election day and it gets to us within a specified time. Some places it'll be 3 days. Some places it'll be a week. California is talking about 2 to 3 weeks. So you won't know on election night what the universe of ballots is. There's obviously going to be a lot of push to get people to vote early so that they don't have issues with the mail or that they don't have their vote invalidated because they didn't make whatever that specific deadline is. But people are people. We procrastinate. We put things off. So it's hard to say how many people were going to mail a ballot on Monday before Election Day, or maybe drop it off at the polling place on election night, 20 minutes before polls close? How many are you going to have people just doing that during the day? Yes, they're technically voting on election day, but those ballots are going to take more time to count than a commensurate ballot that is voted in person on election day because of the processes we were just talking about. So not knowing what that universe of ballots is and then having to actually process them is what leads to delays in counts. Ultimately, that's what gets us to election night and what it's going to look like. It's going to be different. It's going to be unlike any election night we've seen before because of exactly what we were just talking about. To make these calls, we at DDHQ, the folks at the AP, the folks at the networks getting their election counts from Edison Research, you need data. You need to know what the current count is. You need to know where it's coming from. You need to know what areas haven't reported yet. And you need to know a good sense of what the total universe is. Well, for the reasons that we just went through, we're not going to know a lot of those things from a lot of states on election night. Now, there will obviously be states that we'll all be able to call because they have such pronounced partisan leanings. I don't think there's going to be a lot of questions about or surprises in a number of states, and we all know who they are. You can look at the map and you sort of just put those into certain categories. We obviously still have to have the data to make the calls, but you understand where that's coming from based on history and other trends. Unfortunately, those are not the states that generally determine the election. It's the swing states. It's the states that are going to be closer. And those also coincide with a lot of states that are going to take some time to count these ballots. States like Pennsylvania, they simply don't have experience doing this. State like Wisconsin doesn't have a lot of experience with absentee balloting. Even in states that do have experience, like Florida, and who do fairly well with it, they will be challenged by turnout. It's one thing to do it in a primary, as Florida did last week, and they did a fairly good job, but there were still some races that were too close to call for a day or two. But you're going to see massive turnout is the expectation. And as we all saw in 2000 from Florida, 2010 gubernatorial race, the 2018 gubernatorial and Senate races, and even the 2016 presidential took quite a while to call into the night. So it's not going to be quick. We are going to have to just accept that the sites that make these calls, the organizations that collect this data, process it, try to understand it, and make a projection, simply aren't going to have a lot of the data that they need. And that's the challenge that we're all facing. So what people need to be prepared for is election days, maybe even election week, maybe even election weeks. Even if you think, in your personal opinion, you think this will be a blowout for one candidate or another, it doesn't follow that you'll be able to know that for sure and project that on election night, because it will just take time to count those votes to get someone to a blowout. It's just not going to be available. One of the things you will see, and that I think people need to really be prepared for and understand that it is not nefarious, is potential changes in leads. And I say that, but I think it's an inaccurate term, but it's how people think about it. You may see a situation in, pick Pennsylvania, a state we think will have significant challenges in dealing with the volume of absentee voting. You may see one candidate leading on election night because their voters will probably vote in person, or they will vote in smaller counties where they will be able to process the numbers. So the individual totals from the counties may be relatively small, but there are a lot of them and they add up. But a larger jurisdiction such as Philadelphia will have a significant number of votes, and they will take a week or so to count. So what you may see is an erosion of a quote-unquote lead from election night to the point where it becomes essentially a tie, and as more votes are counted, the lead changes hands. One thing people have to think about is election reporting and vote counting is not a horse race. when the ballots are closed, when whatever the deadline is, and those ballots come in, there is a winner. We just don't know who it is. We haven't discovered it yet. The horse race feeling simply is an artifact of how we count the votes. How fast certain jurisdictions with certain partisan leanings or certain outcomes count before others. It doesn't mean it's changed. It's not a foot race where you can see the person in front of you is winning, so you run a little faster or try to run a little faster to catch up and pass them. It's not that. So when people see a lead, quote unquote, change, it's not that the lead has changed. It's just that the number of votes from a certain part of a state with a certain partisan leaning have now been counted. But it was always there. It's almost like a Schrodinger's cat kind of thing. The winner is there. We're just discovering it. The order that we discovered in may look like it's changing, but it's really not. And so people will have a feeling that it seems weird, but again, it's just not. These are things that happened prior. Certain areas will report sooner, and then you say, well, that's great, but these other areas are still to come in, and they're probably going to have a different outcome. And it really, the old chestnut about it comes down to turnout. It comes down to turnout, which voters with what leanings come out, and then it comes down to just which order we count them in. It doesn't change the actual outcome. It's just a process of discovery. And that's something people really need to understand as this goes on, probably in multiple states over the course of a few days. Things aren't changing, just being counted that hadn't been counted yet. So that's pretty much an overview of the challenges that we're facing, why there are delays, and what I think we're looking at for November. Let me just give you a couple of key takeaways that I hope you go away with, and to the extent you think they're valuable, certainly share with your newsrooms and also with your audiences at large. Experience matters. Some states have a history of dealing with these kind of votes. They will still have challenges. They may still have long delays, but they will have a head start. States that don't have that corporate knowledge, that infrastructure, are going to struggle. And that's just the reality of it. You're not going to be able to redesign the various U.S. election systems. We don't have one. We have hundreds, basically. You're not going to be able to redesign that in the last 6 months in the middle of a pandemic. That's just an unrealistic goal, so we're going to have to deal with what we have and adjust it as best we can. Deadlines matter. They matter for voters when they have to get their ballots back. They matter for election officials when they are able to begin processing and working on this mountain of mail-in absentee voting that they're going to see. Knowing what those deadlines are, understanding they still may change in the next few weeks and months, but that's going to go a long way to determining what kind of election results we get on election night and how quickly some of these outcomes become evident to everyone. And finally, I think sort of the biggest takeaway I hope people get is the folks working on this, the election officials, reporters, folks at organizations like the AP, Edison, us at DDHQ, we understand. We understand the enormity, the gravity, the interest, the responsibility that goes with this. Working with election officials across the country, they get it. They know it. Nobody wants to make a mistake. Nobody wants to be the weak link in the chain. So they are doing their best. They're working their butts off. We saw that in Michigan, where we thought it would be days or weeks before they had their primary votes in. And they worked through the night. The folks in Wayne County and Detroit City, they worked through the night to get that done. And we had winners in all those races by 9 o'clock the next morning. I think 7:30 we were able to call the Rashida Tlaib primary, which is kind of one everybody was focusing on. Shocked. I was absolutely shocked we were able to do that. But they worked really hard. And folks across the country are working really hard at this. It's not something people are taking lightly, but it's challenging times. It's challenging times for everyone. And this is unique. You know, national elections in the midst of a global pandemic is not something people had on their bingo card. It's not something you ever really prepare for. And so understanding that everyone is doing their best, they know the stakes, and that we will get there. We have elections in this country, we have winners, we have losers, and we will again this year. It's going to feel different, it's going to take longer, it's going to look different. But in the end, I believe the results will be there, and I believe people will have confidence, or should have confidence, in whatever they say. And I just hope people take that away, that the people in this business, in this space, we know, we get it, and want to make sure that there's confidence in the end results. And I think having 3 independent election collection services, which is unique for this year, should provide that level of comfort to people. If 3 independent, professional, highly skilled organizations are getting to the same point, then you can feel very comfortable that that is the number. Those are the numbers, and that's what happened across the election across this country. So, again, thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. And hopefully you have some questions. Hopefully I was able to cover much of it, but certainly any questions you have, I'd love to field as best I can.
Okay, thank you, Drew. That was fantastic. Great information, very relevant to anyone who is working on election night, producing election coverage. We're ready to take some questions. Just to get things started, Drew, is there a worst case scenario? Is it possible that a large number of ballots just won't be available to tabulate? What is the longest you think we'll have to wait?
Well, there is sort of a built-in deadline here, which I think is sort of the hard stop people should be aware of. Monday, December 14th, the Electoral College is going to meet, and somebody is going to be elected president. That's sort of the official formal step. The next one obviously would be the joint session in early January, but that's where the votes are cast. So December 14th is sort of the hard stop here. If you recall in 2000, and I know that gives some folks a shiver, thinking back to that whole process. The Supreme Court came out with that decision 2 or 3 days prior to Electoral College, and that was really the impetus for that decision. They sort of had to do something at that point. So I think that's what we're looking at. But between the first week of November and the middle of December, I think we're going to see a lot of changes. I expect to see probably a number of court battles. So yeah, it's going to take some time. Realize there's sort of a 2-step process, and some of them in some places will go along with each other. That there will just be the long counts, places like Pennsylvania, where we really expect that to sort of take a while, or potentially Michigan and Wisconsin, some of the states I had mentioned earlier. And then there'll be challenges, and there'll be counter challenges. So that's really what we're looking at. Eventually, I do believe every legally cast vote will be counted. It's just a question of that deadline, and then sort of the definitions of what counts as a countable ballot.
Okay, thanks, Drew. We do have a question from one of our attendees. He asks, why do you think that the vote counts will be so substantially delayed? For example, if people get their votes in on time early, a few weeks ahead of the election, won't they be tabulated by election night and included in the count?
Well, there's 2 parts to that. One, maybe I'm too pessimistic. I think people tend to procrastinate. And again, maybe I'm just looking in the mirror here, but yeah, I think there will be quite a bit of people getting their ballots in, but there'll be quite a bit of people who will wait to the last minute. I was actually watching a similar webinar to this with the Secretary of State of Washington, and it was from earlier this spring when this was just starting to come up. They've done mail-in voting there for a number of years, and so she was trying to give people an idea of what to expect. And this is back in March, and she was saying, you got to hurry. You're near the deadline. And one interesting fact that really struck out to me was she said they get 50% of their ballots back the Monday and after of election week. Washington's a state that will let people trickle in their ballots. So imagine that. And Washington does take time. Washington could take a week. And again, just because they have the experience with the mail-in voting doesn't necessarily translate to fast counts. There's the other piece that I touched on in the presentation about processing deadlines. If a state doesn't allow election clerks to start processing the ballots until election day, sometimes that's after the polls open, sometimes it's after the polls close, there's going to be a mountain of ballots. Regardless of how early people got them in, if you can't start processing them, then the clock doesn't start, September 1st when North Carolina starts mailing their ballots out. It starts, 8 o'clock election night in November. So there's just a logistic element to this. Like I said, some states will do better. Some states will do significantly worse. And again, the experience matters. The process for processing an absentee ballot can be complex. It can take time. And that's just going to be the natural outcome of all this absentee voting.
Right. Okay, for that, thanks, Drew. Just curious, has DDHQ done anything new or different for this election than past elections? Like, are you organized differently? Are you set up differently?
Yeah, we're doing quite a bit of that. There's a couple of elements to that. First, there's the collecting the ballots. The way we're set up, we don't do a lot of in-person, which is the traditional way to do it, where you just go sit in a courthouse. When we started this, our goal was to take advantage of technological changes in how people were voting even back then, how election officials were reporting the votes, how news organizations were consuming data. So we, of the three services, probably rely less on in-person, but we do some. And there are just some election officials that are saying, no, you can't come. You can sit in the hallway, we'll post it on the wall maybe, but we don't want you in our space because of obvious, issues around COVID. So that's a challenge. Beyond that, with all of this expected delay in data, we're collecting and tracking a lot more data points that we haven't in the past. We're tracking ballot requests, ballot returns. In some states, you can get very specific information. You can find out at the county level how many ballots were requested by Republicans. You can find out how many Democrats. Then you can find out how many were returned. Usually not right up until the last minute, but say until that Monday or that Friday. And again, with a late onrush of incoming ballots, it's not going to be precise, but it's a reasonable starting point. And then the next bit that we're going to be tracking is post-election. Now, we always do that. Elections take time to finish up and make final and official. What you see on election night before all this were unofficial returns, but they were basically there. There would be some provisionals that would be counted. There might be some challenges, but they were very much on the margins. But even traditionally, you wouldn't have the official certified final count probably until, early December, and in non-presidential years, even beyond that. So, you made your race calls. You may have had 3 or 4 races that were outstanding, staring at California. And so you would track those and you'd constantly update them. The list of counties and states we expect to have to track following election day has just expanded tremendously. So that's creating a staffing challenge. You also have to have your call team on staff around the clock now. On election night, you figure there's sort of 5-6 hours where votes would come in. Now they're going to come in as much possibly at 11 o'clock on Friday as 4 o'clock on Thursday. So being prepared for that level of uncertainty is something we're spending a lot of time on.
No, that's great, Drew. Thanks. Just to put my producer hat on, any thoughts re-coverage planning? Do you foresee early results coming in from specific jurisdictions? Media organizations might have to do some padding, before they have a lot to say. Any thoughts or pro tips around that?
Yeah, very similar to what we're experiencing. If you plan on having a panel, and this can go down to the state legislative and even the local level, if you're doing some local returns because the ballots just aren't counted. It's not like they count the local stuff and skip the presidency. It's all sort of at once. So you're probably going to need to deal with the fact you'll have what looks like a lot of votes. And one thing we're getting rid of is precincts reporting. That's something that people have always focused on because it's meaningless. Most states don't count absentee ballots in their precinct list. So they could say, we're 100% in. And that means the day of vote's in. But that might only be a third of the overall vote. So why would you say 100% in when there's 2/3 still to come? So what you're communicating to your audience is going to be important, but also the same issue that we have about being available at odd hours for a number of days is going to be something news organizations are going to have to deal with. We, the AP, the networks, we're probably going to be making calls, at strange times. So being ready at a moment's notice, if the right county dumps at the right time, people can make calls, and that's not going to necessarily be on a schedule that you're used to having.
Right. Okay. Thanks, Drew. So just before we wrap up, do you have a prediction which state is going to come in first and which state's going to come in last?
Yeah, that's how, we're sort of looking at, that's another thing we're looking at. I mean, if you look at some states that have a pretty good track record and have some good deadlines, I wouldn't be shocked if someplace like Iowa, Florida is the wild card that everyone's going to look at because of how their system works. But again, we have experience in Florida, not just 2000, but in gubernatorial races and Senate races. So there'll be some states that come in, but they're not going to be the states we're looking at. We're going to be looking at Florida. We're going to be looking at Georgia, North Carolina, and then the upper Midwest and out to Arizona. One state, interesting, that will come in that people are looking at is Texas. Texas has very little absentee voting, as we talked about, as one of those 5 states. And so we'll actually know the results from Texas probably about 2, 3 in the morning. And, I know people are putting that on the list of potential battleground states. I don't have any thoughts on that personally, but, if you subscribe to that theory that Texas is in play, that might be one state you could really start looking at, again, 2, 3 in the morning.
Right. Okay. Thanks, Drew. But, no matter how long it takes, Bannister Lake and DDHQ will be there to ensure that the election coverage is accurate and expertly presented. So thank you for joining us today, Drew. Thank you for all of our attendees attending today. Real-time data has become a crucial part of the visual storytelling process on all media platforms. Chameleon provides a valuable opportunity for media business everywhere to get the most out of their data feeds and integrate visualized data in new and exciting ways, especially with elections. We'll be bringing you additional webinars in the near future, so please watch your email or follow us on social media for more details. If you'd like more information about Bannister Lake and our products and services, please feel free to contact us at sales@bannisterlake.com. If you'd like more information about DDHQ and the amazing work Drew does, please feel free to send an email to contact@decisiondeskhq.com. Thank you for joining us today.